You know, the gospel of Jesus is for everyone. It's a message that everyone needs to hear. We know that it doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, the gospel is a message that you need. It's for all peoples at all times. It goes beyond one's particular culture and race and socioeconomic status and gender and everything else that we identify people by. That's why we engage in mission. We believe everyone needs to hear the message. We all need to hear about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. We need to realize we're sinners, and we need to respond in faith to that message. But we also believe that there are tremendous implications for those who do believe. We know that Christianity is not just a set of doctrines. Doctrine is vitally important. We understand that. But Christianity is not just about what's in your head. Your faith is going to impact your life. When you believe in the gospel, by the grace of God, you start being transformed through the work of the Spirit. You begin to see the world through gospel-colored lenses. The gospel has implications for all of life. Right? Not just what you do on Sunday morning. It has implications for your marriage, your parenting, your job, how you spend your money and your time, all aspects of life. And that's what we want to look at this morning in our text. The implications for the gospel in all of life. Today we're going to be looking at the first 8 verses of Titus chapter 2. Titus chapter 2. And in these verses, we see the Apostle Paul writes to Titus concerning some implications of the gospel, implications of being a follower of Jesus. And he gives instructions to the old and the young, to the male and the female. So this morning, we're going to look at these implications that Paul gives to different Christians at different stages, and these really characteristics of godliness that he tells these Christians to pursue. And then we're going to draw out some additional applications that we see from the text. All right, so let's begin by reading our text, Titus chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. Paul writes, "But as for you, teach what accords with sound doctrine. Older men are to be sober-minded, dignified, self-controlled, sound in faith, in love, and in steadfastness. Older women likewise are to be reverent in behavior, not slanderers or slaves to much wine. They are to teach what is good, and so train the young women to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled, pure, working at home, kind, and submissive to their own husbands, that the word of God may not be reviled. Likewise, urge the younger men to be self-controlled. Show yourself in all respects to be a model of good works, and in your teaching show integrity, dignity, and sound speech that cannot be condemned, so that an opponent may be put to shame, having nothing evil to say about us." You know, Titus is a very short letter. It's only 3 chapters and 46 verses. But Paul is writing to Titus with instructions about the church that Titus was serving in there in Crete. Titus was probably serving a very young church, and it was a church that had problems. And one of the problems in this young church seems to be concerning false teachers and false teaching. I suppose that's an issue for many churches in many different ages, but this was a big concern in Crete. In fact, the first thing that Paul instructs Titus to do in this letter really is to appoint elders in the church, right? Men who are of character and who are of sound doctrine, so that they can teach the church. They can lead the church. And in chapter 1, at the end of chapter 1, Paul describes these false teachers like this. He says, they profess to know God, but they deny him by their works. They are detestable, disobedient, unfit for any good work. You know, doctrine and good works go together, right? Doctrine and devotion, they work together. And Paul is pointing this out to Titus here. He says that these false teachers might profess to know God, They might claim to know God, but their lives speak to the contrary. Their actions do not match their profession of faith. And that's why in chapter 2, Paul begins with these instructions to Titus. He says, "But as for you, Titus, teach what accords with sound doctrine." False teachers lead people away from sound doctrine and good works, but Titus is to teach what is according to a sound doctrine, what's in accordance with sound doctrine. Titus is to teach the implications of what it means to follow Jesus. He's to teach Christian living. Now, of course, I'm sure he taught other things as well, but Paul here calls Titus to teach life and doctrine, to connect these two things, life and doctrine. Titus seems to, again, probably have a bunch of new Christians who really don't know what it means to be Christian, to live as a Christian. So he was to teach them what it means to live life as a Christian. We have a term for that. Paul doesn't use that term in these verses, but we have a term for that. We call it discipleship. And in verses 2 and following, Paul lays out the content, right? In other words, he tells Titus what he needs to be teaching these new believers, what these new believers really need to be taught. And he addresses in this section 4 different groups of people. First, he addresses older men. Verse 2. Older men are to be sober-minded, dignified, self-controlled, sound in faith and love, and in steadfastness. So, you see here that in this verse there's a list of 6 traits given in very quick succession. These are traits that older men are to cultivate in their lives for the purpose of godliness. So let's look at these traits. First, we read that older men are to be sober-minded. Now, this probably refers to being temperate in drink, but it goes beyond that. So not just not getting drunk, but also temperate in thinking. So we might call this a level-headedness. People are older men are to be men of sound judgments. Older men who are Christians are to make good decisions, have right priorities in their lives. Second, Paul instructs men to be dignified. People to be worthy of respect, to live in a worthy way. Older men who are Christians are not to be vulgar in their speech or their actions. Third, they're to be self-controlled. This would mean that they're people who can control their passions. They aren't going to fly off the handle in anger or make rash statements or act in a rash way. The last 3 traits are soundness. Right? Soundness in faith, love, and steadfastness. Now, faith, of course, would involve trusting in the Lord and His plans. Love would involve love for both God and neighbor. And then steadfastness involves a patience and endurance in one's life. So, they're to be people who live well even in difficult times. When things are straining, they are still living well. They're still steadfast, or they're still sound in faith and in love and patience. Next, Paul turns to older women and gives instruction for older women. Verse 3 and following. Notice what he says here. Older women likewise are to be reverent in behavior, not slanderers or slaves to much wine. They are to teach what is good, and so train the young women. Notice that when Paul addresses older women, he uses the word likewise. He also does this when he talks to younger men as well. And I think that's important here, right? Older women are to cultivate the same traits that Paul called older men to cultivate. Right? In the same way with later on in the text with younger men. They are likewise to cultivate all these other traits as well. So older women are to be sober-minded and self-controlled and all the rest. But Paul also addresses some other traits as well that women need to cultivate to grow in godliness. So there's a couple different characteristics that Paul mentions here. Older women are to be reverent. Now this is, again, it's very similar to what we saw in the previous verse, but reverent in speech and actions, right? Paul also mentions that they should not be involved in slander. Slander involves speaking falsely about someone. So when we slander someone, we're injuring their character, right? We're spreading untruths or accusations about a person. That's what slander involves. And Paul says older women should avoid that kind of speech. The next characteristic that he mentions is not being slaves to wine. This, of course, is meaning that a godly older woman should not let alcohol control her. Perhaps this was a particularly prevalent problem in Crete. But actually, if you think about it, this trait is listed among many virtue lists in the Bible. It's actually given as a requirement for church leadership, right? Those who are in the offices of leadership in the church, the same trait is given for them as well. My point is that the inclusion of that should not be unexpected here. Now, there's also another instruction that Paul has for older women. Verse 4, he says women are to be teachers. And specifically, they're called to train up younger women. Now, Paul is probably not talking about teaching that occurs in a classroom setting or something like that here. Now, of course, that's not wrong to have, classes like that. But that's probably not what Paul is talking about, especially considering what he says in the rest of verse 4 and into verse 5. What he's probably talking about here is more of an informal teaching, the type of teaching that occurs through day-to-day living. And as we're going to see in a moment, this type of teaching primarily concerns the home. Right? It involves being a godly Christian wife and godly Christian mother. And so older women here are called to pass down the wisdom that they have learned, especially wisdom concerning the home and the family, down to younger women in an informal way. That's, I think, what Paul is getting at. Older women passing down these truths, these nuggets of wisdom, or even more than nuggets of wisdom, this teaching of wisdom down to younger women in the church in an informal way. Now, the content of the teaching is described in verses 4 and 5, and this makes up Paul's, I guess, maybe his charge to younger women. He doesn't say this exactly the same way that he does the others, but in a way it kind of makes up what younger women need to do in order to grow in godliness. Notice what he says that younger women are to learn. They're to learn to love their husbands and their children, to be self-controlled, pure, working at home, kind and submissive to their own husbands. Again, there are several things here, but the primary concern is the home. A Christian woman's first and most important ministry is the ministry of her home. Now, of course, there might be other ministries that she's involved in, and there probably will be other ministries that she's involved in, depending on her circumstances and her gifting. But the primary one is the ministry of the home. The younger woman is to learn to love her husband and her children. Love is not just a feeling, but it involves actions. That's why Paul tells younger women that they should learn to love, right? Because love isn't just a feeling that we can't control, right? Love is the actions that we do control. And sometimes there's sacrifice involved in love. Love isn't easy all the time. So that's why he says, younger women, learn to love. Paul also mentions self-control here. Again, probably kind of a theme, isn't it? But along with self-control, he adds the word pure. This is probably referring to sexual purity. So the woman should be faithful to her husband, right? A woman a godly younger woman should be faithful to her husband. She should have the reputation of purity in the relationship with her husband. Older women are also to teach younger women to work at home. Again, like I mentioned before, a Christian woman's primary responsibility concerns her home. Now, that does not mean, I want to be very clear about this, that does not mean that she can't work elsewhere, that she can't work outside of the home, and it's wrong for a woman to work outside the home. I'm not saying that at all. The godly woman in Proverbs 31 is described, it seems, as working outside the home and doing different things outside of the home. But nevertheless, the home is an important area of ministry for women. And this is an area that older women can teach younger women to minister better in, or be better ministers at. Next, Paul mentions kindness. Younger women are to learn to be good and kind, gentle to others. Learn to be considerate, we might say. And then finally, Paul mentions submissiveness. Wives are to be submissive to their own husbands. Now, of course, this teaching can be taken the wrong way. And it doesn't mean that the woman should be a doormat or something. I think that word submission has a very bad connotation in our culture, and it's hard for us to wrap our minds around it. But the wife is to submit graciously to the loving leadership of her husband in the home, right? It doesn't say that she's to be submissive to all men categorically, like women are less than men or something. Don't read it like that. Paul specifically says to their own husbands, and so he's talking about in the home. There's a hierarchy, if you will, in the home, God-given hierarchy. We'll talk more about this kind of stuff in a minute. But finally, though, Paul addresses younger men, and again, he mentions self-control. But he says likewise, right? So again, he's probably talking about some of these other things as well, but specifically adding, okay, younger men, self-control, right? Maybe a particular problem with younger men to have that self-control, that level-headedness, not raging, not letting their passions consume them. And so younger men, be self-controlled, or reminding them again, specifically, hitting this home, specifically to younger men. Now, of course, these aren't the only traits and characteristics that Christians should be growing in for the purpose of godliness. I mean, we can look at other places in the Bible and find other lists of characteristics that should be developed in Christians. We know that, right? And again, it was probably the case that, you've got to think of what was going on. Probably the case that Titus was ministering to a young church with many believers, many new believers, and so these things he had to hit on. And we also know that Crete was not a particularly moral, upstanding place. Crete had a reputation. Paul even mentions this reputation back in chapter 1. He wrote, one of the Cretans, a prophet of their own, said, Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, and lazy gluttons. Right? In other words, they did not have a good reputation. So it seems like the Cretans probably had problems with things like sober-mindedness and being temperate and being reverent and telling the truth. They had trouble with these things. And so perhaps Paul here is listing these some very particular areas in which they needed to grow in godliness. They needed to grow in these areas of godliness, particularly because their lack of these areas was so glaring. But all these characteristics apply to the same to us today as well. As Christians, we need to be pursuing self-control. We need to be pursuing soundness in faith and love, sober-mindedness, all these things. We should be pursuing them for the glory of God. And that's probably the main application of the text. But I want us to think about some additional applications of the text. Again, we should grow in these characteristics, like Paul tells us the people of Crete to grow in, the Christians at Crete. But we're going to look at a couple other things as well. So first, we need to understand that the way Christians live is important to our faith. The way Christians live is important to our faith. As followers of Jesus, we're called to live in such a way that often conflicts with the world around us. We are to look different when we seek to grow in godliness. So, this is not something new for 21st century Christians in America. Sometimes we think, Christians today, we face a unique situation, right? If we live like the Bible calls us to live, we're going to stand out. And we act like that's a new problem for Christians. That's not a new problem for Christians. In fact, that is not a bug. It's a feature of the faith. Like I mentioned before, Crete was not a morally outstanding place. It was a rough place. I read somewhere that the people of Crete viewed heavy drinking of alcohol as a virtue, not a vice. Now, I'm not sure what information the author was going on, but it really does show you the nature of the Cretan culture, right? They like to get drunk, right? They like to drink to excess. And yet Paul very clearly states here that Christians needed to be sober-minded, self-controlled, and not slaves to too much wine. In other words, be different. So we have to realize that Christians are often going to stick out, right? When what we profess about Christ needs to be backed up with our actions. Now, I want to be very clear here. We don't live this way in order to be saved or to earn the love of God in some way. We live this way because we are saved. We live this way because we have been loved. Obedience is not the cause of our salvation. Obedience to Christ's command is the result of our salvation. It is the evidence that we are in Christ. But there's also another reason here for Christians pursuing godliness. It is related to our witness. Paul mentions in this in verses 7 and 8. He says, "Show yourself in all respects to be a model of good works, and in your teaching show integrity, dignity, and sound speech that cannot be condemned, so that an opponent may be put to shame, having nothing evil to say about us." So Paul is telling Titus here to live a life that's full of good works and godliness, so that those who oppose Christianity won't have any reason to disparage Christians. Again, he's saying, don't live like everyone else. Be a model, be a witness, right? Be the salt and the light in the world, right? So we ought not to pursue godliness just for personal reasons, but we should also pursue a life of godliness because when we do, God is glorified. It brings glory to God. Another application is this. Men and women are equally made in the image of God, but God also designed different roles for them in the home and in the church. Men and women are both equally created in the image of God, but we have different roles. When we go back to the creation story, we find that men and women are both made in the image of God. Genesis 1:27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. So we're equal in the image of God. We're made equally in the image of God. But God has given men and women different roles. And we see those different roles when we read about the family, especially in the New Testament. And we see that here in Titus as well. Now, this really goes against the grain of our society because we're told that there are no differences between men and women, or there should be no differences between men and women. We're told that gender is a societal construct, that it's really not a real thing, but it is just something our society has made up. That's what we're told. I kind of think it's kind of like the game of telephone. You ever played that game when you're a kid? You know, you have kids lined up and a person has a message and they whisper the message to the next person in line and you continue down the line with the message until you get to the end. And typically the final message is much different from the original message, right? Every time the message gets passed on, it gets corrupted a little bit. And by the time you get to the end, there are so many corruptions that the final message has little similarity to do with the original message. Well, I think that this is kind of what has happened with God's design for men and women. It has been corrupted in such a way that what the Bible says is good and right is now seen as something terrible to many people in our society. For example, several years ago, a woman named Linda Hirschman wrote a book called Get to Work, a manifesto for women in the world. And in an interview, she degraded women who have chosen to make home their priority and their main ministry. She said that women who stay at home are not using their full human capacity, they are not independent, and they are doing more harm than good socially. She also said that they were delusional because they believed that they were doing what was good. And she said that those who chose to stay at home and care for children, well, that's a task unfit for a complicated and educated woman. So God calls women to minister in their homes, to their husband and children, and to be a primary ministry in their lives. And yet, many see this calling as beneath a woman of intelligence. Hirschman even called a woman who seeks to engage in this kind of ministry as her main ministry, not using their full human capacity. Women, and especially young women, I want you to know that your calling in the home is important. And I want you to understand that the Bible is not restricting you in its roles to women. But it does teach that your role pertaining to your family is your central calling. And when you're living out that central calling in your life, you're going to be blessed, and you're going to be satisfied, and you're going to be fulfilled in a way that nothing else can. Don't let the world belittle your calling. Don't listen to people if they tell you that you could be doing so much more with your life. Don't listen when they say you're never going to find satisfaction in the home. Don't feel bad if you refuse to sacrifice your family for your career. God has called you to a great and glorious calling. Take joy in that call and embrace it. All right. One more application I want us to think about this morning. And we see in this text that God's design for discipleship involves older Christians teaching younger Christians. Older Christians teaching younger Christians. We especially see this in the instruction that Paul gives for older women teaching younger women. Right? The older women were to teach and train the younger women. They're called to this ministry of discipleship in the church. And we cannot underestimate the value of this type of teaching and training. Sometimes we are accustomed to thinking that the best education is kind of the education that comes from formal training, right? Even in the church, sometimes we think that discipleship is something that mainly happens in a class. And while it is true that formal training and discipleship is very important, there are some things that we have to learn informally and put into practice kind of in informal ways. Think about all the things that women were instructed to teach the younger women. Paul says that younger women need to learn to love their husbands and their children, and to work in the home, and to be submissive in these things. Well, how are they going to learn these things, and what it means to live out these things in a godly way? Well, it's through the informal teaching and informal discipleship. This stuff is not just theoretical knowledge you can just put in your head and keep there and it's okay. No, it is learned. These things are actually learned and practiced through the course of living life together. The older woman models for the younger woman these things. It's a come and see type of learning. Now, some of you might be thinking, isn't that what mothers are for? And I would say that that training is part of what mothers should do. But I would also say that this is a responsibility of the community of women in a local church as well. Many of you older women may have learned to live godly lives and manage your families from your godly mothers. You saw that in their lives and they passed that down to you. I think of Susanna Wesley, who was the mother of John, who was the founder of the Methodist movement, and also the mother of Charles, who was a famous hymn writer. We sing some of his hymns today. Well, she was a very godly mother and a godly wife, and you can read about her biography, a very godly woman. But, not everyone has a Susanna Wesley in their lives as their mother. Right? Many young women in the church today did not grow up in a home where there was a lot of Christian influence. And it is hard to know how to be a Christian mother and Christian wife if you never had that influence. And also, we live in a time, something else we have to think about, we live in a time in which many people move away from home because of school and work. And maybe you've had children that have done that. You know, they've had to move away for school or for work. And women may need to get a lot of that instruction from the home, about the home, from someone else. Because their mother's not there, maybe hours away. What I'm saying is that a young woman should not be excluded from this type of ministry just because it's not available from her family of origin. Right? The women in the local church have a responsibility to teach the younger women. Not just a responsibility, but it's also a privilege. It's a ministry, and we need to look at it like that. And I need to say this as well. Older is very comparative, isn't it? All right, a young married woman could disciple a teen, right? A woman who's been married for some time could disciple a newlywed, right? And so older is relative, right? Older doesn't mean you got to be 80 or something like that, or 90 or whatever, right? It's not an age; it's relative term. Now, but on the other hand, young women, young Christian women, need to be willing to learn. They need to be teachable, because sometimes we have a problem with what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery, in that we favor the young and the new, and we don't have time for the old. You know, young people don't have to. Young people think that the old is bad and the new is good, and we don't want to listen to what the generations who have lived before us have to say to us. But young people should realize that older people do have something to teach. There's a lot of wisdom in living from a godly older man or older woman. And that can be very useful to you in your life. And this is the way God designed it. And we should take this model very seriously. But the point is, this morning, is that no matter who we are, as Christians, we have been called to pursue a life of holiness and godliness. So let's seek to live in a way that He has called us, no matter where we are in life. Male, female, young, old. Let's seek to live out His commands, to grow in godliness, to pursue godliness for His glory.